anyone and everyone. Welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam, and Kelly is unable to join us today, so instead my mom is back to discuss another Illinois case.
Hello, everyone.
This case that we're going to discuss today took place in Illinois in 1960 and was pretty recently back in the news. But before we get to it, Kelly and I typically ask our intro question, so instead I have one for you.
Okay, I'm ready.
You've been to a lot of concerts. Which one is your favorite one?
My favorite concert? Oh my gosh, I have been to many.
A lot of good ones.
I have. My very first concert, I have to say, is probably one of my favorites. It was Tom Petty.
I'm still very jealous of that one.
Yeah. I was 14 years old. My neighbors were going, and one of the guys that was going, his girlfriend got sick. And they called me. They said, "Hey, we're leaving in 10 minutes. Can you go?"
Oh, I didn't know that.
Like, oh, yeah. And so I had no idea. It wasn't planned. And it was just, and I didn't really know who Tom Petty was. This was, gosh, what year was that?
That would have been early, mid
79. Yeah, 78, 79, something like that. So that was really a really great concert.
Wasn't Dad's first concert a neighbor too, with the Wings tickets and the radio?
It was his aunt's friend won those tickets on the radio, and she couldn't go at the last minute, so his aunt took
his aunt. I thought it was a neighbor, but yeah, I remember it was like, "Hey, like you're like 10, you want to go to Wings?"
Yeah, and he was at that time. He was a huge Wings fan, so yeah, it was. That was probably his favorite concert too.
Well, he's seen Paul McCartney a handful of times. Wrigley might be the most favorite. That's just special.
That was really, really special, and we had really good seats. We were in the 20th row, but it was 110 degrees.
That was a hot weekend
on the field of Wrigley Field that year. But it was an amazing night, and we made a whole night of it. It was really fun.
Yeah, you kept calling me and Ashley and leaving us voicemails of the songs.
Well, I didn't want you. I wanted you there with us, so wanted to share as much as I could.
We gotta go see them a few years later at Lollapalooza.
Yep. Yeah, that was a fun concert too, but we lost you that night.
Yeah, because Ashley went to go meet up with you, and then I was like holding the spot. And then none of our phones worked to like meet up.
It was. I've never seen so many people in my life.
Yeah, Lollapalooza was a lot.
Yeah, it was really fun though.
It was
Loved
fun.
It.
All right, well, let's go ahead and dive into today's case. We'll be talking about the Starved Rock murders on March 14th, 1960. And you're not familiar with these murders, are you?
I'm not at all. I remember going there as a kid, but I was not aware that there were murders there. And my family never told me about that.
That actually really surprises me, especially if you went there as a kid, because this was huge news. Like, it was all over by the time you were born. So, like,
yeah,
someone was convicted of it and everything before you were even born. But it was such huge news that people are still talking about it today. So I'm kind of surprised you didn't know anything.
Yeah, so I'm really green on this one. I know nothing.
It's a very sad one, but it's a very interesting conversation. Starved Rock is in LaSalle County in Illinois, and it's only about 90 miles southwest of Chicago. And according to legend on StarvedRockLodge.com, in the 1700s, the Anilowick killed the chief of the Ottawa tribe. His name was Pontiac. And this led to a battle, and the allies of the Ottawa, which was the Potawatomi tribe, they actually surrounded the Anilowick on a ledge. And if the Anilowick attempted to get down off this ledge, the Potawatomi would have had the upper hand, and it would have been a slaughter. So they basically just attempted to ride it out on top of this rock. And unfortunately, the Potawatomi had the same idea, and the Anilowick ended up running out of food and water and starved on the rock. Hence,
Oh, that's why it's
Starved
called
Rock.
Starved Rock. Ah, okay. I never heard that story.
It's legend. There's a lot of people say that this isn't true, but it's a well-known legend. Maybe I'll have to do another Incorrect Legends if I can dig into it and find out more.
Add this to the list.
Right? And long before it was known as Starved Rock Park, the area was formed by glaciers. So it's kind of this pocket in Illinois where there's a lot of different elevation, which we don't have a lot of in Illinois, which is why it's so popular.
Yep, the flatland.
Exactly. So in this specific area, there's a lot of caves and caverns kind of amongst all of the rocks. And it wasn't until 1890 that it actually became a tourist destination. And it was at that point that the first lodge was built. And it became a good place for like a day trip from Chicago. So that's kind of when the tourism started.
And what town is this in?
It's kind of like right by a handful of towns. I think Oglesby is the closest.
Okay, so LaSalle County. Okay.
Yeah. It's about 90 miles from Chicago.
Yeah, my memories of going there as a kid are vague.
It's not terribly far from like Ottawa. I'm trying to think like the bigger counties, the bigger towns in LaSalle County, but I'm not coming up with any off the top of my head. But yeah, I think when you look it up, it usually like just says LaSalle County because it's a state park within the county.
I was thinking we probably camped there when I was a kid.
Probably.
So then we would go there for the day while we were camping. I was trying to picture where would we have been camping. And I think we camped at Sandwich, Illinois.
Okay, I think I saw it on the map because I was looking up
so
some
I think
distances.
that might be nearby.
Yeah.
So that's probably where we were when we were down that way.
Yeah, and with it being such an easy day trip, and just an easy trip in general, from the city, it has lodges, a big lodge and cabins, so you can have longer stays as well. And that's what Mildred Lindquist, who is 50, Lillian Oding, who is also 50, and Frances Murphy, who is 47, just wanted to do for a couple days, starting out on Monday, March 14th in 1960. Mildred, Lillian, and Frances were from Riverside, Illinois, which is just a western suburb of Chicago. So
nice little town.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, they were part of a middle upper class town, maybe even a little closer to upper class in Riverside.
Yeah, Riverside is beautiful. Yes.
We'll get to kind of what their husbands did. Their husbands were all very successful, so they certainly weren't hurting for money or anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Riverside is just about 85 miles from Starved Rock, and the three women were really good friends. They all attended the same church, and they just wanted a couple days away from their husbands and kids, so they planned this 4-day trip to Starved Rock. Frances Murphy, who went by Frankie to her friends and family, she was the wife of the vice president and general counsel for Borg Warner Group.
Borg Warner, yeah. They do like motors or something.
They do some auto manufacturing stuff. I was looking it up.
I knew that was a familiar name, yeah.
They did a lot of appliances for a while. I think that's where they got a lot of their money in the 60s, was home appliances. But they're a huge company. So being the vice president and general counsel, you're high up there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's a big deal.
Yeah. And then they also had 4 kids. So she was a stay-at-home mom, but, she has her hands full with 4 kids.
Well, and she's 50 here, so her kids might be...
Yeah, I don't know exactly how old her kids were. I know I was watching a documentary, and I don't include it in my script here. I think it was, I want to say Mildred. Her daughter had just gotten married not long before this happened.
Yeah, usually, especially back then, at 50, your kids are adults.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they're like late teens, like at the youngest, or
Yeah,
adults.
yeah, could be.
Um, but Mildred Lindquist, she was married to the vice president of Chicago's Harrison Trust Savings Bank. So
Okay.
they also
Yep.
were doing quite well. They had 2 children. And then Lillian Oding was married to an official at Illinois Bell and Telephone Company. So all kind of big companies there that they're all pretty high up for. And then they had
Yeah.
3 kids. So all of these women, as we just kind of said, for most of their lives, probably had their hands full with numerous children. And then all 3 are also incredibly active within their local Presbyterian church. And they were also known to be leaders in their community. So, like, they definitely were doing a lot, despite not having jobs, technically.
Oh, yeah, busy.
Yeah,
Yep.
they very, very busy women. Sounds like they were always out doing stuff and organizing things and kind of kept events in the community running.
Yeah, yep.
And Lillian was particularly excited for this trip because she spent the last handful of months caring for her husband because he had a severe heart attack. And it sounds like it was very, very bad. And so she's really just spent most of the last few months at home caring for him. The ladies left Riverside in the morning, and they were in Francis's Ford station wagon. And according to an article in Time, each woman kind of had their own agenda on top of just relaxing with their friends. Mildred brought a bird book. She wanted to start bird watching. Lillian brought a book called The Lincoln Lords, which is about a business executive who kind of fell on hard times, and it was his wife who helped him get back onto his feet and thrive in the business world again. Which,
I like that.
right? I read some reviews on Goodreads about it. A lot of people don't like it, but their comments are like, it was written in the late 50s. Like, you can tell it was written in the late 50s. But I felt like that story kind of mirrors her because she was at home nursing her husband back to health and hoping to get him back on his feet and going back to work.
Yep, those strong women behind their men.
Exactly. And then Frances brought her knitting supplies with her. So they all just kind of wanted to go together, but also had their own plans in mind. And they'd also brought their 35mm camera so that they could make sure to document their weekend. And
yeah, great memories.
Yeah, exactly. And I can show you some of the pictures. We do have some pictures of their trip where they looked like they were really enjoying themselves. But the women arrived in the lodge late to mid-morning, and they were able to check in, and they had 2 rooms in the lodge that they rented. So once checking in, they just went in there, kind of dropped their stuff off, maybe did a little bit of freshening up before having lunch in the dining room of the lodge. And after lunch, they decided they were going to take a bit of a hike. According to Weather Underground, it was about 22 degrees that day, so it was chilly, but it was beautiful.
Yeah, that's really cold.
Yeah, it was. I think it was because this was March, so I think it was like a spring cold where it's kind of warm because the sun's actually warming you up.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they hiked for about a mile, so they were out there for a little while, and they were stopping quite a bit to take pictures and stuff.
Nice.
And it was definitely still snowy. It was completely snow covered, but there's some frozen waterfalls within Starved Rock.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and so that's what they were going to go see. They actually kind of ended their walk near a frozen waterfall and started to turn around. And it looks beautiful. I've looked at a ton of pictures of what it looks like in the winter in Starved Rock. So I understand why you're going out in 22-degree weather.
Yeah, that's worth the walk and the cold.
Exactly. So eventually they made it to the end of the trail, which was at this waterfall, and it was just about 1 mile from the lodge at the end. And it was in this area called St. Louis Canyon. And like I said, they just really wanted to view this frozen waterfall. They took some pictures. They stopped to birdwatch a little bit. They had the little birdwatching binoculars with them. And they started to turn around and go back to the lodge once they reached the end. And then later that day, George Oding, Lillian's husband, called the lodge because he didn't get the call that he expected to get from Lillian that evening. And he talked to an employee at the lodge who told him that Lillian wasn't available at that time. And they said to him that the ladies must have just gone out and they haven't returned at this point, and he just recommends trying to call in the morning. They're probably just having fun. So the next morning comes around. George tries to call again. He still couldn't get a hold of his wife, so he again called the lodge. And an employee said to him that he saw the women in the dining hall for breakfast. So George at this point, he's a bit annoyed, but he also assumed that his wife is having a good time with her friends. So he's just going to try to call back later.
Yeah, at least he knows that someone saw him.
Exactly. And that night, there was a big snowstorm that was described as blizzard-like conditions hit the area. I think it estimated about 6 inches of snow fell that night. And George still hadn't heard from Lillian. And come Wednesday morning, George hadn't heard from her since late Monday morning, basically when they left. And he called the lodge again, and this time they told him that they didn't know where the women were at this point. And
Oh boy.
George insisted that the lodge go check their rooms. And when they got there, they saw all their belongings were there, but their beds were made. And then he said, okay, go to the parking lot, see if her car's there. And the car was in the same spot, parked as it was on Monday, covered in snow from Tuesday night's storm. And George knew something was wrong at this point. He knows he would have gotten a call from Lillian. And the fact that no one at the lodge really knows where they are, they haven't seen them in quite a while, he went into a full panic at this point.
Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah. So he contacted a friend, Virgil W. Peterson. And Virgil W. Peterson was the operating director of the Chicago Crime Commission. And he told him, like, I can't get a hold of my wife and I need help. And Peterson immediately then contacted the police to report Lillian, Mildred, and Frances missing. And nearly immediately, the LaSalle County Sheriff's Office were setting up a search parties for these women. I'm sure
Wow.
if you get a call from the operating director of Chicago Crime Commission,
Oh,
you
yeah,
act
definitely.
on it. But
Yeah.
it was very fast once that call came in that they kind of took action and went to work.
Yeah, 3 executive women missing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And who has good friends.
Yeah, friends in the right places.
Exactly. So local authorities helped a group of young men from a nearby youth camp conduct a search for the state park, in the state park. And the search ended pretty shortly after it begun because they came across the bodies of Lillian, Mildred, and Frances in a cave near St. Louis Canyon.
Oh.
And this was just about a half a mile from the lodge, so it seems like they were making their way back when something happened. It was immediately clear that the women were murdered. There were trails of blood that could be seen in the cave and on the snow around the bodies. And all 3 of them had their heads bludgeoned, essentially crushing their skulls. Yeah.
So three women. So if they were attacked by one person,
Mm-hmm.
I don't
We'll
know
get
how
to
they
that
didn't-
conversation because that's a big part of the theories
Yeah.
and kind of people's
Oh.
thoughts. But yeah,
This is
no,
awful.
you're right. It 3 people against 1, and these were 3 fit women.
Yeah.
Like they,
if they were going on
fit
an
women.
adventure like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Bill Danley, he was a local reporter. He's kind of the one that I'm pretty sure he wrote a book about this. He's been on a ton of different news shows. He's like the main reporter because he heard about this essentially first. Because when he heard the news, he was just finishing up what he was working on. And it's like, great, got my keys, I'm immediately going. And he went straight to the lodge. And as he's like pulling in the parking lot, he heard a ton of people shouting that they had found the bodies. So Danley quickly asks a young man that he had known, who he saw running through the parking lot, and he kind of pulled him aside and was like, tell me what happened. Like, give me all the information right now.
Yeah, yep.
So he learns that it's very apparent that the 3 women were murdered. So he quickly went right into the lodge to call the newspaper. So within hours of them being reported missing, their murders were nationwide news. Like, incredibly fast.
Yeah.
So
that's such a big deal. I mean, you just don't.
Yeah, and there wasn't, like, we have a lot more protections now in the news than, like, he just kind of stumbled on it, made the phone call, and it became nationwide news. Like, there's a lot of different checks that they go through now that it still happens fast, but it's usually when not necessarily when it should be announced. Like, authorities do have some say on what goes into the news when they didn't really before at this point.
Yeah, yeah.
So
they have to, now they know they have to protect people.
Exactly. None of their names were released. I don't think anyone officially, well, that might not be true. They knew who they were looking for. I don't know if the kid who told Danley knew their names. So I don't know if the names were immediately released, but I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if they were.
Yeah.
So authority...
Or they could just say 3 ladies and, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But the authorities began to investigate the scene, but the terrain made it very difficult. And according to StrangeOutdoors.com, they ended up sweeping some of the snow out of the way and even using like torches and like the kind of flamethrower type things to clear their path. So they potentially were damaging evidence during this. But they needed to clear the snow. So they just melted it.
Yeah, not even thinking that what else is going to be affected.
Yeah, and I've seen, there's actually some pictures of them. They called it like a weed burner to like burn off grass, essentially. It's like a flamethrower, essentially. And like there's pictures of them doing this in this cave that I was looking at when I was pulling photos for our socials. But the 3 women were lined up in a row in the cave, clearly placed there or staged. And the amount of blood found inside of it indicated that the women likely were not murdered there, but instead they would have been dragged there. But due to all of the snow the night before, any sign of potential drag marks or anything like that was just covered up. So they really weren't able to find out too much. They just could tell that they likely didn't die right where they were found.
Yuck.
Yeah. Well, we're getting through all of this part of it pretty quick, and we'll move on to not talk about how brutal it was.
Yeah.
But the 3 women's legs were spread, and some of their clothing had been torn or removed. They did determine, I will say this now, that they do not believe any of the women were raped. Mildred and Lillian were actually tied up together using twine. And Frances, she was also tied up, but it looks like her ties kind of came apart. So it wasn't very tightly tied. But she was also tied up using the same twine. The camera that they brought with them from their hike was found with a broken strap and blood smeared on its leather case, just a couple feet from them. And the bird watching binoculars were also found just a few feet from them on the floor of the cave. And they also found another thing that was the potential murder weapon. And it was a large frozen branch that was covered in blood. It was like 3 feet long. Yeah.
Killed him with a branch?
A branch. And it was probably, its diameter was probably like 4 inches, 5 inches. It was very large.
Huh. Just to wield that around. I mean,
exactly.
Branches are heavy.
And it's frozen.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
They also found a large icicle with blood on it. So that brought into question whether there was 1 or 2 murderers with potentially 2 murder weapons.
Yeah.
They were less confident about the icicle, but it was enough for them to still question it. And then there was also blonde hair found on Frances's glove and black hair found on Lillian's hand. And I don't believe any of this matched the women. I never saw that called out, but I've also, when it's mentioned in these articles, it's called out as odd.
Yeah.
So I'm making the assumption that it doesn't match any of the women. But given the time period, they also really couldn't conduct tests on the hair to get any information out of it. So they just kind of noted that this hair was found. And the autopsy did show signs that the women were molested, but as I said earlier, they were not raped. And this seems to kind of be taken into question in some articles, whether that's true or not. So a lot of articles do say that, which is why I included it.
Yeah. Well, it seems logical that they would be raped, but I guess logic doesn't really go into that.
Well, it's confident that they were not raped. It's questionable whether they were molested or not.
Okay.
But that was one thing that they did clearly say, that like none of the women were raped. And they were also able to determine that the women were murdered shortly after lunch on Monday. So it was during that one hike.
Yeah, that first. So that they weren't seen by somebody for breakfast in the morning.
The employee was confusing them with some other people.
Okay. Oh.
Yeah.
Bummer. Yeah.
And so there were photos from that 35 millimeter camera that were developed to see if maybe they had any clues. And there were a lot of photos of just the women on their hike. And some were triple exposed. So essentially it was just like layering images on top of each other in one photo. And it made it really difficult to analyze them. But despite the
if you didn't advance the film,
exactly.
It's so different.
Yeah, and there was, I think it was 1 or maybe a couple photos that were triple exposed. And in one of them, it looked like there was this figure kind of behind them, like a shadowy figure in the background. And they thought maybe that was somebody kind of lingering in the trees behind them. And that potentially could be the murderer. But as they continued to examine it and getting more experts to look at it, they determined that this was a result of the triple exposure and not a human figure lurking. But they thought this was like their big break. And after investigating and taking inventory of the 2 rooms where the women booked in the lodge, investigators determined no jewelry or money was missing. So the likelihood of a robbery was ruled out. And
yeah, well, if they did they think that the guy went back to the lodge?
You never know. Like, kind of just ruling anything out.
Yeah, I suppose.
And seemingly there was no evidence that gave investigators a motive for the violent murders, or even where to start looking for their suspect. And authorities were receiving a ton of criticism. And it seemed like the person who was most vocal about the criticism was Virgil Peterson, the friend of George, who was the operating director of the Chicago Crime Commission. He was very loud about this criticism. He was upset with the fact that it took so long for the lodge to realize that the women were missing after multiple calls from George. And he was really upset that the county government, or county police or state police, didn't have any officers in the park. So he wanted officers in there to help prevent crime.
Yeah, like rangers or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And he was upset that with the lodge not notifying, that this just delayed the realization that the women were missing, and that he was upset that the employee had made the mistake, which I get, but at the same time, like, the employees don't know these women, so they might not know them by, like, immediately looking at them and saying, yes, I know for a fact that is them. Like, that's, I don't, like, it's a sad mistake, but I don't think it's necessarily something to be super upset. Like, I understand being upset, but
yeah,
I can't blame her.
Well, it was an innocent mistake.
Exactly.
It wasn't, malicious in any way.
And at this point, this criticism was so discussed in the media that it really spread amongst the community, and people started locking their doors for the first time, not letting their kids out to play.
I bet.
There were some articles that said stores were selling out of deadbolts to install indoors, and that they were selling out of guns. And so this really scared the community.
Yeah. Yep. I bet it did.
And with no leads in the investigation, it started to slow down. But due to its publicity, they spent so much money on the investigation. They spent over $65,000. And in today's currency, that would be over $678,000.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
A lot of money. But the thing is, they had nothing to show for it. And that was making people incredibly angry. So
no results.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's like, obviously you want to spend the money on it because you want to find the solution. But, like, this community is so terrified, and you're spending the money and you have nothing. So District Attorney Harland Warren had actually spent his own money to buy a microscope so that he could look at the twine in greater detail.
Wow.
Yeah. And he was able to determine that it was actually two different types of twine that were wound together. He actually,
like, the beginning of forensic investigation.
Right? He completely took it apart. He discovered that there were, like, 12 pieces in one twine that, like, made up the twine, and then 20 pieces in the other twine. And so he completely took it apart to figure out, maybe this is something. And he appointed 2 detectives to conduct the investigation into where the 2 types of twine came from, because he really wanted to limit the press and limit who had their hands on this information. So these 2 detectives could only report to him. They weren't allowed to talk about it with anyone else, even if they're in the department or not. So Warren and these 2 detectives begin to ask lodge employees if they've seen either types of twine, and they were able to determine that both types of twine were used in the kitchen. And the detectives actually...
The kitchen of the lodge?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Huh.
And so the detectives, they actually went to go look at the purchase records of the lodge, and they contacted the manufacturers of the twine. And with all their investigation, they actually did determine that lodge came from the kitchen's supply.
Wow. That's a huge lead.
It's a huge lead, yeah. And this is the first time that they've had a lead, and they actually felt like they were looking in the right direction. And investigators conducted polygraphs on basically everyone who worked at the lodge. And everyone who went through the polygraph came back as clear. There was no red flags. And again, that lead just went nowhere. But Warren kind of became to question the legitimacy of the polygraphs. And he hired an outside firm from Chicago to conduct additional polygraphs and re-interviewed employees and former employees. So in late September 1960, they used one of the cabins at Starved Rock and one by one brought in each employee and former employee. And typically each interview took about 15 minutes. They were pretty quick. But there was one interview that took a lot longer. And one of the detectives, he brought in this former dishwasher named Chester Otto Weeger. And his interview took over an hour. When Warren looked to the polygraph technician after Weeger's interview, he says that the polygraph technician just went pale and that he told him that, and the detectives, that, like, this is your man.
Oh, boy.
Like, this is the guy.
Like, he's guilty.
Yes.
Okay.
So Weeger was 21 years old. He had previously worked as a dishwasher at the lodge, but he had quit. To also put this into context, this polygraph took place, I believe, in September of 1960. So this is about 6 months after the murders.
Yeah.
But Weeger had quit working as a dishwasher during the summer of 1960, a couple months after the murders, so that he could go into business with his father painting houses. And Weeger was married with 2 young children.
Oh, he was married?
Mm-hmm.
He was young.
21. And he was a slim man, and he was described as looking like James Dean. So, like, women found him very attractive.
Yeah, good-looking guy.
And Warren remembered Weeger from when the investigation began. Weeger had apparently shown up to work on the 15th, the day after the murders, with scratches on his face, and he told investigators that he had cut himself shaving. And no one seemed to question it. He also told the investigators that when the murders happened, he was in his basement writing letters. And again, no one questioned him.
Yeah.
Like, it's 1960, you write letters, but that's just kind of a weird alibi to me.
Well, yeah, in his basement, is his wife home or his kids there?
Yeah, it's weird.
Why are you in the basement?
Yeah, like, a few more questions should be added on there.
Yeah.
So now that they had their eyes on Weeger, they asked him to do 4 more polygraphs. And he agreed. He was very cooperative. And he also turned over a buckskin coat that had dark red stains on it. And with the testing capabilities that they were able to determine that the stains were blood, but they couldn't determine if it was human blood or animal blood. And it has since been tested, so we'll discuss that in a bit. But with the 4 additional polygraphs that he took, he failed all of them.
So he didn't give an explanation of what the blood was?
No. At least not that I read. I could easily... This is a big hunting area, so I could easily understand that being a very simple explanation. But I never actually saw that said.
Hunt in a buckskin coat, though. Well, who knows what they did in 1960.
I've seen photos of the coat. It kind of looks like 1960s version of a Carhartt.
Okay.
So I could easily imagine him hunting in a buckskin coat.
Okay. I'll buy that.
But I never saw the explanation of hunting. That's just my assumption because
Yeah.
I've looked up the area so much now. It's a big hunting area.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
So Warren and the investigators also began looking into Uyghur's past and other unsolved crimes in the area, seeing if they could connect anything. And they learned that there was a young couple who, I think they were high school age, who were in their car, and a man approached them, tied them up, raped the young woman, and then robbed them in 1959, just about a mile from Starved Rock. And that crime has gone unsolved. Unfortunately, it's gone unsolved partially because the police didn't believe their story and they didn't investigate.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. So Warren spoke with the victim and she gave her a photo lineup, which included Uyghur. And she was slowly reviewing all the photos, just looking closely. And the moment she got to Uyghur's photo, she began to scream. So that became very positive confirmation that they believe he was involved in that crime as well. And at this point, Uyghur is under 24-hour surveillance. And once they had the positive identification for the lineup for the 1959 crime, Warren immediately wanted to arrest Uyghur. But he was kind of torn on whether he should or shouldn't, because they only had circumstantial evidence at that point. It's witness statement. And this was also an election year, and Warren was up for re-election as DA. And so he was nervous about rushing an arrest, that maybe that could be viewed as a publicity stunt, and he didn't want that to be like the topic of conversation. He really wanted his previous experience as DA to kind of speak for itself in his campaign. Unfortunately, he should have arrested him if he wanted it to be a campaign, because it didn't help. His opponent was running on a platform of Warren fumbling the Starved Rock investigation, and Warren lost the election by 3,500 votes.
Oh, and that's a lot probably in the
that
area
was
at the
big
time.
loss.
Yeah.
So he's out of office at that point. But before he officially ended his DA career with that role, he did arrest Uyghur on November 16th, 1960. He was arrested for attacking the young couple, and investigators hoped that arrest for the couple specifically would put more pressure on Uyghur, and he would end up confessing to both crimes. After the arrest, Warren had the investigators relentlessly question Uyghur. They kept him in the interrogation room for hours, well into the middle of the night. And they basically exhausted him with these questions.
Yeah. I know that's a tactic that they use, but...
Yeah, I think there's rules now where they can't do this. Like, it's still done to a certain extent, I think.
Yeah, I think it is too.
But to this level, I don't think they can do.
Yeah.
And at one point, Uyghur stopped the investigators and asked for his family. And the next day, Warren brought in Uyghur's parents. And they gave him a few minutes alone. And after they left, one of the detectives said that Uyghur seemed to have changed. So that detective sat down with him, and he said, quote, "Chester, why don't you tell me about it? There's just two of us here. Just tell me about it." Like, he tried to be kind of empathetic. Like, I can see that you're not feeling good. Let's talk it through.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Uyghur responded, quote, "All right, I did it. I got scared. I grabbed their pocketbook. They fought. I hit them. So he, like, basically just came out and said it. And apparently the pocketbook that Uyghur is referring to was the camera case. He was hoping it would be one of their purses.
Yeah, they wouldn't have a purse on a hike.
Yeah, it was like a leather case, so I could understand where
Yeah.
you could confuse that.
Yep.
And Uyghur reviewed his confession on paper. He signed it. And then Warren could move ahead on charges for the murders in addition to the rape and robbery charges. And when asked to provide much more detail, such as why he dragged the bodies into the cave, Uyghur said that he had actually seen a small plane overhead and didn't want the bodies to be spotted, especially if that plane could have been from the state's police department. And investigators were actually able to determine, using a pilot's logbook, that there was a small white plane flying over the state park at the time of the murders. And so everything kind of seemed to fit. This seemed to be the truth, the real story.
Yeah, everything fit.
So Uyghur repeated his story multiple times for investigators in the following days. They had even asked him to return to Starved Rock and reenact the crime for investigators and reporters.
Mm-hmm.
During this reenactment, he said that he only intended to rob the women, and he grabbed what he thought was the purse, instead being the camera bag, and he broke the strap on it. And he told the women, like, after this failed robbery attempt, to, like, keep on walking, and this would hopefully give him the opportunity to get away and just kind of run off into the woods. But instead, he actually decided to stalk the women, and to the point where he actually jumped out of the woods in front of them, forced them towards the cave, where he tied them up with twine from the kitchen, and apparently intended on leaving them tied up in the cave. But Frances, who was the one who was tied up individually, was able to get out of her bindings and attempted to hit Uyghur in the head with the binoculars that they were carrying. And this is...
So he went out there intending to rob people with twine.
Yeah, I never really saw an explanation of that. I don't know if he just was, like, working, because it was twine that was from the kitchen and he was a dishwasher. So I don't know with his role why he would even be near, like, touching the twine.
Right.
But I don't know if he, like,
Right.
just, like, tossed it in his pocket and just went on a hike and then saw an opportunity to rob them. That was never fully explained.
Yeah.
I think it was very much a crime of opportunity. At least when it comes to the murder using the branch.
Yeah. Well, yeah, he didn't go out with a weapon.
Yeah, like
It's twine.
I think this is like, it was,
Weird.
if there was like premeditated thought, it was very much robbery. Like premeditated as in like well ahead of time. It would
Yeah.
have been robbery. But
Well, it would be nearly impossible to be premeditated because you don't know when people are going to go out for a hike.
exactly.
In 22-degree weather, you know.
Well, if
in a
you're at the
snowstorm.
lodge, I'm sure a lot of guests would. Like, you might go on a hike, like, assuming you'll run into somebody. But, it's hard to tell, and I never really saw that explained. Because we'll get to partially why this isn't explained in a little bit here. But he said that Frances was able to get out of her bindings and attempt to hit Uyghur in the head with the binoculars, and that he attacked them after this with the large branch. And this also makes sense because when they were found, Frances's bindings were really loose and like falling off of her. So it would make sense if she was the one to attempt to hit him. And he said that he staged the bodies so it would appear as sexual assault, which is also why I think it was speculated early on whether they were or weren't
Mm-hmm.
assaulted. And he's saying he didn't. And when asked about the fact that he didn't actually end up robbing the women, he didn't take the camera, he didn't take anything from them. If he wanted to, he probably could have gotten into their rooms pretty easily because he worked there.
Yeah.
And he said, quote, "It all started with robbery, but I don't even know what I needed the money for." So it wasn't really
It was just a
robbery.
compulsion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So by November 19th, 1960, Uyghur had met with his attorney for the first time. This is after the reenactments, kind of after all of that. And also, remember, this is before Miranda rights.
Oh, okay.
Miranda rights was 1966. So,
okay. Yeah, I had no idea.
yeah, I actually had to look this up because I couldn't quite remember. But yeah, Miranda rights were 1966. So, like, he did have a right to an attorney, but they probably didn't tell him that. So I'm assuming he gave all these confessions before he even had the knowledge of getting an attorney.
Yeah.
That's my assumption, but
Yeah.
makes
Yeah.
sense.
Well, it's logical. Yep.
And this is when his story changed. He claimed innocence. He said that he was coerced by investigators to confess. He said they threatened him with violence, actually held a gun to him to sign the confession, and that they had fed him the information about the plane and the details for the reenactment.
Yeah. Well, they could have said, was it because there was a plane,
Mm-hmm. Well, he's saying, you're saying it, there was a plane there. Like, from his explanation of it, it's like they gave me in great detail what I'm supposed to tell people. So in January of 1991, the trial began. And
1961?
Yes, January of 1961, the trial began. And Uyghur was indicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder, and then 8 other felonies that related to the prior assaults with the young couple that we previously discussed, in addition to a prior assault that the police believe he had also committed, which I don't really have any details about. And if he was convicted, he could have been facing the death penalty. And the new district attorney, Robert E. Richardson, he actually decided that he only wanted to bring 1 charge of murder to the trial. He wanted to drop the other ones. And this was in the event if Uyghur was acquitted, he wanted the ability to charge him again for the other murders.
Yeah. Separately.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah,
So double jeopardy.
Exactly. Yeah, he wanted to make sure this guy gets locked up. And Uyghur's lawyer tried to explain his innocence, saying that the police had an alternative motive trying to find the murderer due to the media's pressure. And they rushed the process to press charges and failed to find real tangible evidence. And he wanted the confessions thrown out. And Uyghur's lawyer was not successful in this, which obviously is a huge benefit to the prosecution's case. And one stumbling block that the prosecution did face because of Uyghur's lawyer, the defense fought to have the photos of the crime scene not included in the trial. And they won. They said it was, quote, inflammatory and would prejudice the jury against the defendant.
But if the defendant didn't do it.
Yeah, like that felt to me like a very kind of weak argument. I was really surprised.
Yeah, if those crime scenes are from the scene, that is directly relevant to the case, and not it isn't inflammatory unless he did it.
I think it was more of the 1960 of it all, because they were very violent and graphic photos.
Yeah.
I think it was like, oh, people don't really need to see this, even though it's very important to the case.
Yeah.
They were able to see one photo, but only one. And Uyghur's buckskin jacket that we discussed earlier obviously came up during the trial. And investigators at this point said that after testing the jacket, they were able to determine that it was indeed human blood. But animal blood also could not be ruled out because of the tanning treatment on the buckskin. It said that it makes the results inconclusive. So they like, yes, we tested it. We did find human blood, but it because of the tanning treatment, it still could be animal blood. So we're not really confident. And the trial lasted about 5 weeks, and the jury deliberated for nearly 10 hours.
Oh, that's quick.
It was pretty quick, especially for such a huge trial.
Yeah.
So on March 31st, 1961, just over a year from the murders, Chester Otto Uyghur was found guilty in first-degree murder for Lillian Oding. He was sentenced to life in prison. And he would be eligible for parole in 20 years. After the trial, reporters asked the jurors if they were aware that Uyghur would be eligible for parole after a relatively short period of time. Like 20 years is a long time, but kind of in this instance, that's a pretty short period of time.
For the crime, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the jurors said they were not informed of that. So if they had known that, they may have gone for the death penalty.
Well, how did they not get that information?
They said they were never told. They said life in prison, but they were never also told life in prison means, in this instance, parole after 20.
And then if they were just regular people, they don't know to ask that question.
Yeah, and not everyone, nowadays, we're much more informed about our legal system because we have the internet to learn that information. That wasn't a thing. It's not sort of stuff they talked about in the newspapers as frequently.
Yeah, they had Perry Mason.
Yeah, there really wasn't much.
That was it.
So after receiving the news that Chester was convicted, the district attorney decided not to bring the other charges forward because they were really hoping for the death penalty, but they felt like the state likely wasn't going to hand the death penalty down in his case. So they just kind of... I think it was kind of like, let's not waste the money and go through this again. He's in prison type of thing.
Yeah, well, it is. It's a big expense.
Yeah, it sucks for the families. That's really terrible.
Emotional. Yes.
So minimally, legally, he was not held responsible for the deaths of Mildred Lindquist or Francis Murphy. So Uyghur's first attempt at parole was 1972. His request was denied, and it would continue to be denied over and over again. He wrote letters detailing how he was potentially framed for the murders and coerced into a confession for both the Starved Rock murders and the prior assault and robbery in 1959.
Mm-hmm.
And Uyghur kept applying for parole. And one thing the parole board takes into consideration is remorse. And when Uyghur asked if he feels remorse for his actions, his response was, quote, "I'll stay in prison for the rest of my life to prove my innocence before I take any deal with any of you crooked people." Yeah. And this is
nice.
Decades after his arrest, that he's still very strongly claiming his innocence.
Now, and they never had any other suspects the whole time.
Not that I saw. Nope.
Yeah.
Like, there were definitely avenues they were looking into, but everything very much led to a dead end.
I wonder what his parents said when they went in there.
Me too. I wonder if it was... Well, no, I don't... Like, I was going to say, I wonder if it was something where it's like, just say you did it, because then you'll get out sooner, and this whole thing will be over for you.
And just cooperate.
Yeah.
Stand up, be a man. Yep, that's what I'm kind of picturing.
But it's also like, if you have confidence that your kid didn't do it, that's not going to...
Right, so that's why I think if they said that, they must have suspected that, he's got some problems, and he would be someone who would do something like that.
Yeah, that's true. I couldn't really find much about what he was like younger. It didn't, like, I never saw reports of him getting into trouble. Doesn't mean he didn't, but yeah, obviously parents would know.
Yeah, exactly.
So in 2000,
and there was never interviews with the parents or any of that.
Not that I saw. I do want to finish it. I felt like it was a very biased documentary, and I wanted to try to be as unbiased with this as I could. But I'm very interested to finish it. There's a documentary on HBO called The Starved Rock Murders, I think.
Oh, we'll have to check that out.
I watched the first episode, and it's done by the son of one of the prosecutors who tried him. And the son was reevaluating the case because he's like, I'm not fully confident he was guilty. I want to look at all the evidence myself, and I'm going to make a documentary out of it. And like, he's interviewing his father, the prosecutor, and his father's just like, why are you doing this? Like, I did all of this already. Like, we found him guilty. I did this.
Yeah.
And he was like, there was a lot of tension. And he's just like, I don't know. I just feel like I need to do it too.
That's funny.
So yeah, I'm really interested to watch it. But it was very much about Uyghur. It wasn't about Lillian Francis or Mildred at all, really. And I wanted to kind of focus on that more. So I stopped watching it. But I'm going to probably finish it this weekend.
Yeah. What is it on?
HBO.
Netflix? Oh, HBO. Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's like a 3 or 4 episode, like, mini series documentary. The first episode was good. They interviewed a lot of people. I did use some of like the background information for this case from that, because they did go over the facts and showed a lot of photos and stuff that helped me. Mm-hmm. But in 2004, his lawyer had the buckskin coat retested to see if they could get any viable DNA. Unfortunately, the coat had been handled and touched by so many different people that the DNA would have been contaminated.
Oh,
they had like school groups coming in.
And they were like not, the coat wasn't covered or in a plastic bag. It was just everybody's.
No, I think, I didn't see this specifically explained, but my assumption is that like they had like school tours and stuff, like kids touching it, where this was probably long before they even understood the capabilities of DNA, because that wasn't really until like the late 80s and then the 90s when we really learned the importance of DNA.
Well, and just forensic investigating, they didn't know to protect
exactly.
things.
And this happened in
and
the
that,
60s.
Testing would come out years later.
Exactly.
They
could have had these kids in there in like 1970 and still had no clue.
Yeah, exactly.
So in 2010, Uyghur asked why he had never shown remorse. And even if he could like show the remorse, he could just be granted parole. Like, just say it. And Uyghur replied, quote, "Why should I feel remorse if I never killed them? I mean, I feel sorry for people being dead, but I'm not going to admit something I've never done." So still 2010, he's saying the same thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of murderers never admit what they do.
I just think it's really hard to keep up the lie. But I don't know. I don't know. Like, this one
I
I'm
think it's
really
hard for
not
people to
super
admit to
confident
it.
on. I think he likely did it, but I don't know. I do, like, wonder.
Well, when you were going through it, and you hear about this confession and the way that went down, it is questionable. You think about that one in Manitowoc, where
Oh,
the younger guy.
Dassey, Brandon Dassey.
Yes,
Yeah.
and
Another
how
Wisconsin
they,
case.
but he was a you know mentally challenged young man, so he was maybe more influenced than the average. But we don't know about this guy. He could have been on the spectrum.
He could have been. We would probably never know because the testing wasn't really a thing.
Yeah. Well, and back then, you just sloughed it off as weird or introverted, or
Back
you
then, they were
didn't.
still putting people in asylums for this sort of thing.
Yeah, and reform schools.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of thing. The young boys got in trouble and went to reform schools. Their parents couldn't handle them, and
Yeah.
that's what was done at that time.
Yeah. So yeah, who really knows with him?
Yeah.
But I do question it
So
because
that confession is a little bit iffy, but
yeah, it's the confession where it's like I can understand how that was coerced. I get it. Do I
but
believe
there's
it? I
a
don't
lot
know.
of evidence. It's not all circumstantial,
Most
right? I mean,
no,
he had
most of it's
twine.
The twine came from the lodge, but how many people had access to the lodge? How many employees were there?
Well, true.
Like, there's those things where it's like, yeah, like that kind of fits. It fits well, but it could fit well with a lot of other people as well. So I don't know.
Yeah.
But in 2019, after 58 years in prison, Uyghur was granted parole.
Huh.
And in February of 2020, at the age of 80 years old, he was released to a rehabilitation center in Chicago. And
80 years old.
At 80 years old. And even after being released, he still claimed his innocence. He said, quote, "They ruined my life. And they made millions of dollars off of me publicly by keeping me locked up for 60 years for something I'd never done."
Huh.
So, like, that also just, like, it just sounds so sad if it's true that he
That's
didn't
very
do
sad.
it.
Yeah, if he didn't do it. And then whoever did do it got away all that time,
Exactly. And
Yeah,
in that
that's pretty
documentary,
horrible.
I was talking about Murders at Starved Rock. What part of the first episode is they're walking around, I think it's like a county fair or something, and they're just asking people, like, what are your thoughts on Chester Uyghur? And people are very adamant about their views in one direction or another. Like, they're very strongly believe he's guilty or very strongly believe he's innocent. And some people, like I said, some people believe the confessions, other thinks it was truly coerced. But as we were just kind of saying, there's no physical evidence that led the investigators to Uyghur. It was that polygraph technician that first said it.
Yeah, he's your guy.
Yeah, and then with the lack of ability to test the DNA on the coat, like, I think that there's a good possibility it was human blood. Like, that's the one thing that makes me think it's him more than anything, is, like, if that was really human
too
blood.
bad. It's too bad that was compromised and couldn't be tested.
Yeah, but then there's the other thing that kind of throws a wrench in it, is the hair that was found on Francis's glove and Lillian's palm. There was blonde hair and black hair found.
Oh, yeah.
And neither
what
one of
color
those
was Uyghur's
matched.
hair?
His was like brown hair. And so it didn't match. And then there's the question of, like, a slim 21-year-old. Could he overpower 3 healthy middle-aged women?
Yeah, and that's what I was just going to say. It's like, okay, it's 3 against 1, and they're, good sturdy women. I don't know. I guess I don't really know that.
Yeah, and then the potential of the icicle is a second murder weapon.
Mm-hmm.
Like, those are questions I really just don't know.
It does feel like it almost had to be more than one person. But yeah, you hate to think that some guy sat in jail all those years.
Exactly.
Is he still living? Do you know?
He is, and as of July 16th, 2024, Chester Otto Uyghur is no longer under supervision by the Department of Corrections. So he is 100% a free man. He is not living in any sort of Department of Corrections home or anything. And overall, Uyghur served one of the longest prison sentences in Illinois history.
Wow.
I think the longest was 64 years.
Wow.
So yeah, he is officially a free man. He is 84 years old. But what do you think about this one? Because that's kind of all we got.
I don't know. I'm like, I feel kind of sad. I'm doubting if he did it.
Me too.
But I think that murderers are liars, and I think it would be really hard for a murderer who said I didn't do it all those years to actually come out and say, okay, I lied all that time. Yeah,
I think it would
murderers
be such a
are liars.
coincidence to have two people out on that trail come across the three women and just decide to kill them. That's what would have had to have happened if it wasn't Uyghur. Because I think it would have been two people. I do think that that's a possibility with the hair found. But also, like, could the hair have been on Frances's glove? Potentially be her husband's or her son's or whatever.
Or someone that stayed in her room the time before.
Yeah.
And I wonder about the interviews with the other staff people at the lodge. Was anything, like, fishy at all?
It doesn't sound like it from what I've seen. I've seen some people say that he was kind of a loner and kind of a little weird, but in the way of, like, we just never talked to him, so he must be weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like, who knows at that point?
Yeah, weird. I don't know. I feel like, shoot, I hope this guy did it because I don't want someone to have gotten away with that.
Exactly.
And I wouldn't want him to be in jail for not doing it. Yeah, it's, 1960, it's...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I'm surprised you never heard about this one, because this changed how people lived. Like, this is why a lot of people started locking their doors.
Yeah, I do not remember this being a conversation in my house at all. But, I also lived through some things that my family never really talked about. I don't remember,
Gacy.
like the Chicago riots, or
yeah.
We never talked about that stuff. And I did as a teenager, but not as a little kid. I was born in '63, so I was young for that.
But
stuff.
you were like a couple neighborhoods away from. Well, Gacy was, a lot of his victims were from Chicago. But from where he lived, you were a couple neighborhoods away.
But I was a teenager for Gacy.
He was going for young teenagers.
Yeah. I had said this at the time. I knew someone who knew someone that was one of the victims. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I didn't know any of the victims personally. He was 2 towns over from me.
Yeah. He was in Norwich.
So he was in Des Plaines and Norwich, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I was at high school, I was in Palatine. So that would have been pretty far for him.
But still, just like, that was major news. But you also, he was very clearly going after young men, teenage boys. And all of your brothers would have been older.
Oh yeah, my brothers, my next brother up in age was 10 years older than I am.
Yeah, so like that was certainly not that demographic that Gacy was going for.
Yeah, my brothers were a lot older. Yeah, this is a very sad story.
Right. It is a sad one, but I think it's also like the investigation This is the type of investigations that like need to be evaluated and talked about.
Yeah. Now I really want to go to Starved Rock. Next time I'm in town with you.
I know. I've never been to Starved Rock.
Oh, well, I have no memory or very little memory of it, so let's go.
It looks beautiful. I've spent a lot of time looking at pictures.
Dad says he remembers day trips down there a lot when he was a kid.
I'm surprised even when I was little we didn't go, because we would go up to the UP in northern Wisconsin and do hikes and stuff all the time.
Yeah, but we will always, and that's why I think I don't remember, because we always went north. We always went to Wisconsin.
Yeah, we never really went south and did stuff.
Yeah, it was rare that we went south.
We should go now.
Yeah. Yeah, let's do it.
Well, thank you all for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? If you liked this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can follow our show on Spotify. And you can now find us on YouTube at Have You Heard About This Case, on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, on TikTok at HYHETC, or you can email us at haveyouheardaboutThisCase@gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll talk to you later.